Archaeologists have made a sinister find. The skeletons of over 100 newborn babies thrown into a Roman sewer. Who killed the babies of Ashkelon, and why? To solve the mystery, scientists have used contemporary crime investigation techniques, including DNA testing. The story they investigate is a murder mystery nearly 2,000 years old. A tale of sex, death, and infanticide. On the shores of Israel's Mediterranean coast lies Ashkelon. A seaport since 3500 BC, it became one of the most important cities of the ancient world. The Romans conquered Ashkelon in 37 BC. Ashkelon was a vital strategic acquisition. Whoever held it controlled access to the Middle East. The Romans stayed for 4 centuries. The city was finally destroyed during the Crusades. For the last 15 years, archaeologists from Harvard University have been digging into the secrets of Ashkelon. Ross Voss made the most intriguing find yet, the mass burial of babies in the city's sewer.
We started probing down beneath the sewer below the bath, which is behind me here. And when we reached the gutter of the sewer at the base, we just started discovering a number of bones and shells and lots of broken pottery. And one of the volunteers remarked, who was excavating inside, that she started finding all of these chicken bones. And I came over and I started looking at them, and I thought, well, they could be drumsticks, but I wasn't exactly sure. They looked a little strange. And then I started seeing some other bones that didn't seem to be parts of chickens, so we had our funnel analyst, Paula Wapnish, come by, and she all of a sudden pulled out one of these little ribs and was horrified to say, these are not chickens, these are babies. And we realized right then that we had a number of infants that were thrown into the gutter of the sewer beneath the bath.
This is a unique find. Baby bones are often mistaken for animal bones and thrown away, but in Ashkelon, excavators are finding bones that are unmistakably human.
The largest and most common that we seem to have are fibulas and tibias of the legs and arms and part of the radial bones of the limbs. In addition, we've also discovered these scapula bones from the back and fragments of skulls, which are unfused and so coming in small plates like this. And we have the ribs, which are probably the most numerous parts of the baby that are found inside the deposit of the gutter.
The team uncovered the bones of more than 100 individual babies. It's the biggest single find ever of ancient infant remains. They also found coins, jewelry, and pottery, which helped date their find, mid-3rd century. And over 15 years after the dig began, bones are still emerging.
And right now, as I remove some of the rubble, I see a few small bones, which are parts of a rib of one of the infants. I've got maybe an arm bone here. So it's very rich in remains.
Voss and his team discovered the bones while excavating this sector on the slopes by the sea. First, they uncovered a small bathhouse. It had a hot pool and mosaics, like all Roman public bathing places. Then they dug beneath and discovered the position of a major sewer.
On my left, there's a large underground sewer. It continues to the north and makes a very sharp right turn and goes before me here. At the base of the sewer, we have the gutter which contained the baby bones beneath the bathhouse.
bathhouse itself was small. There were just a handful of rooms inside. It probably had 2 stories and a tiled roof, like many buildings in this once grand city. Today, Ashkelon is a minor seaside resort, enjoyed by local families. But in the 3rd century AD, when the babies died, it was a powerful seaport, a stronghold for Rome. Head of the Ashkelon excavations, Professor Larry Steger knows the history of the city better than anyone.
Ashkelon would have been a bustling seaport where you had a whole variety of people gathering together here or living here as well. There probably were the people of the Hellenistic Roman era that had their own religion, the so-called pagans. There had been small communities of Jews, small communities of the early Christians, but coming and going all the time would have been the sailors, would have been the merchants. Ashkelon was highly developed at that time because Rome took an interest in it and wanted to see it thrive as a great seaport.
Ashkelon was the gateway to Jerusalem and the Middle East. Pilgrims and sailors came ashore here. Merchants traded goods from all around the empire, and the city grew rich. In the 3rd century AD, it was at its peak, with 15,000 inhabitants and grand buildings throughout the city. A great forum ran across the center, leading towards the theater. A massive basilica ran east-west towards the sea, and overlooking it on the hillside were villas for Ashkelon's rich. Beyond the villas were poorer districts, and it is here that the archaeologist's bathhouse stood. Like all bathhouses, it was a popular place for socializing.
Well, of course, a port like this would have been quite an attraction to sailors who would come in, and they could have had all kinds of different foods and drink, of course. They might have involved themselves in gambling. We find dice, you know, in different places at the site.
The archaeologists believe that theirs was a small private bathhouse, one of many in Ashkelon. The social center of the complex was the changing room, where bathers could eat and drink, play games, and exercise. Everyone went to the baths, men and women, free men, and slaves. Throughout the empire, the authorities encouraged bathing as a civilizing influence that helped enforce Roman values. But some bathhouses had a rather dubious reputation. Men might meet their mistresses there or find prostitutes. So why were there baby bones in the sewer beneath this building? What was the link between the bathhouse and the dead infants? The mystery now had the archaeologists in its grip.
This is a unique discovery. Archaeologists always want to have something new that has never been seen before, try to understand some kind of mystery, because this then becomes a mystery. What are all the babies doing in the gutter and just thrown in like trash instead of you know, having a nice burial? And we didn't know exactly what was the cause of all this. Could it be an epidemic that raged through the city and everyone was forced, like in the plague, to just dispose of bodies as quickly as possible?
Voss took the bones to Jerusalem for forensic analysis to find out how the 100 babies died, whether it was plague or massacre or murder. At the Hebrew University, 2 forensic scientists would attempt to get to the bottom of the Ashkelon baby mystery.
It was a juvenile, about 12, got hit on the head 3 times.
Pat Smith is a forensic anthropologist. By looking at bones, even those thousands of years old, she can work out the cause of death.
It's got some interesting...
She does the same work as a pathologist, but with skeletons, not corpses. Her first observation about the Ashkelon case was vital.
The interesting thing is that these infants seem to have been buried shortly after the time of death. If we look here, you can see that quite unusually for infant remains recovered after nearly 2,000 years, that we have indeed all parts of the skeleton, including very, very small bones. This suggests that they were buried shortly after death, when the soft tissues were still present, and that this was their first and final resting place.
Smith's next piece of detective work was to find out if the babies died of disease.
One of the things that we look at is the surface of the bone. If there's been any disease or infection, then the body responds by the formation of irregular new bone. This bone, which is an upper arm bone, a humerus from Ashkelon, you can see that the surface of the bone is relatively smooth. If I look at the same bone of an infant but from another site, you can see here that there's a lot of very irregular, almost stripy bone on the surface, suggesting that this infant was ill, at least in the 2 weeks or so before he died.
So the Ashkelon babies were healthy. Professor Smith now had a hunch about the cause of death, but she was lacking a crucial piece of information, the baby's age. For this, she had to examine their teeth.
What clinched it for me was based on the development of the tooth germs. This is the tooth germ of an infant from Ashkelon. Less than half of the crown is present. If we can compare it with that of an individual from another archaeological site that was aged at around 9 months at the time of death, there's quite a big difference.
Judging the precise age of an infant is extremely difficult. The latest forensic method is to look at a cross-section of a tooth bud, highly magnified. Like the rings in a tree trunk, layers of enamel are laid down on teeth at regular intervals.
Enamel stops forming for 24 hours or so after birth, and then carries on again at more or less the same rate.
But for the Ashkelon babies, the picture was very different.
On the Ashkelon infant teeth, what we saw was only this amount of enamel formed, that is down to here, and none of these lines at all appear. There's no evidence of survival beyond a few days.
The Ashkelon babies were newborns, leading Professor Smith to one conclusion.
None of these infants, by any stretch of imagination, could be as much as a week old. That really is the strongest evidence to suggest that these were intentionally killed and placed there.
The fact that all the infants were so young is crucial. According to anthropologists, when mothers kill their infants, it is almost always within the first few days of life, before the maternal bond becomes too strong. So the Ashkelon babies, all 100 of them, were either killed and put in the sewer, or taken down alive and left to die. It is the best forensic evidence ever found for the ancient practice of infanticide, a form of population control. In the Roman world, infanticide, the killing of an unwanted child, was not a crime. It was a form of birth control. Newborn babies who were sickly or simply unwanted were abandoned. The Romans, cultured in so many ways, could be brutal when necessary. Eleanor Scott is an expert on Roman attitudes to babies. These were very different to our own, which are cushioned by the advances of medical science.
We start to view a baby as having an identity whilst it's still in the womb, from the fact that a woman can tell if she's pregnant from the first day after a missed period to the photographs we take of babies in the womb. And a woman can invest an immense amount of almost romantic love in that baby because she expects it to survive. For a Roman woman, the situation was incredibly different. She couldn't afford to invest any powerful feelings in that baby, especially in the newborn stage, because she might likely lose it.
The Romans had a strange idea about babies. They believed that newborns were not yet fully human. This protected them from grief when infants died. It also made it possible for them to abandon those babies they did not want. The practice was known as exposure. Rather than killing a baby directly, a mother would leave it somewhere where it might or might not be picked up and cared for by someone else. It was up to the gods to decide the child's fate. But in the Ashkelon case, it was very different. It was not in the lap of the gods to decide whether or not these babies were rescued.
When we look at the Ashkelon evidence, it really is quite stark. It was a direct murder of the newborn by discarding them in the sewers. So there was no possibility that these were going to be rescued by anyone.
But is it possible the babies were killed before being placed here?
We don't know if they actually were dead before they were placed in the sewer. One would always like to think that the material that one is dealing with suffered an easy death. These are people. These were people.
But for the Romans, newborn babies did not yet count as people. And one sex in particular, archaeologists believe, was marked out for death.
Usual victim in infanticide are the girls. This we know from both ancient evidence and modern ethno-histories. It's generally the female that is the victim of infanticide.
Archaeologists have long assumed that the Romans preferred to keep boys and discard girls. But it is a belief based on very little evidence. Chiefly, one letter, written in 1 BC from a man called Hilarion to his pregnant wife, Elise. There are a few references to killing baby girls in classical literature, but there is no real forensic evidence. Hilarion is away from home on business and writes to Elise,
"Warmest greetings. Know that we are still in Alexandria, and do not worry if the others return without me. I beg and beseech you to take care of the little child, and as soon as we receive our wages, I'll send him to you. If, and good luck to you, you give birth before I return, if it's a boy, let it live. If it's a girl, expose it."
But to assume, on the basis of a single letter, that all Roman families preferred to get rid of girls is controversial to some experts.
It's just one letter. They are just one family. They might have had very special circumstances. Maybe they're completely broke and they can't afford to have any more daughters because perhaps they've got daughters already. And to take that one letter and use it to build this big theory, this big picture of sort of mass culling of unwanted baby girls, strikes me as being very dangerous, because we just don't have the broad archaeological and historical evidence to support the idea that infanticide was the killing of girls and only girls.
The Ashkelon infanticide case was a unique opportunity to find out if the Romans really did expose more girls than boys. For the first time, there was real forensic evidence to investigate. But there was only one way to discover the sex of the infant bones: by testing their DNA. Ancient DNA research has revolutionized archaeology. The secrets of the long dead can now be investigated scientifically. But it is difficult and sometimes controversial work. Dr. Andrew Merriweather is one of the world's leading ancient DNA experts.
There's no way of knowing really when you get a bone whether it's going to have DNA in it or not. And even if it's recovered, very often it may be fragmentary. It may only give you a small part of an answer that you're looking for.
The DNA of every individual, alive or dead, is unique. It is the blueprint for our sex, appearance, our susceptibility to disease, perhaps even our personality. And it is present in our every cell. Within each cell's nucleus are chromosomes. Within these is our DNA, a chemical consisting of two interlocking strands of molecules. The molecules are organized into sequences called genes, and each gene determines who we are and what we look like. When we die, much of our DNA gets destroyed, but in bones and teeth, it may remain, although fragmented, for thousands of years. Ancient DNA researchers have recently made a breakthrough. They can now test infant bones to discover their sex.
Normally when you want to sex a skeleton, find out if it's male or female, you would look at the pelvis, you might look at the shape of the jaw, but those things all get that shape after puberty, and so it's not present in infants, and you can't tell a difference between males and females from a skeletal perspective. But when you look at the DNA, those differences are there at birth, and we can tell that from ancient DNA from infants or from anyone.
Every human being carries 23 chromosome pairs, and the 23rd defines our sex. An X, accompanied by the smaller Y, means the person is a male. Two X's identify the individual as female. Unlike the shape of an infant bone, it's unmistakable. In Jerusalem, the forensic team jumped at the opportunity of using DNA to find out the sex of the Ashkelon infants. It would be the first real evidence about the sex of Roman infanticide victims. In Jerusalem, Dr. Marina Fairman began DNA testing the Ashkelon bones to discover their sex. She was under no illusions about the difficulties of her task.
It is much more difficult to work with ancient DNA than with modern DNA, because modern DNA will always give you results. You know, maybe sometimes the results that you don't want to get, but they will get the results definitely. With the ancient DNA, you can't predict that you will get anything.
The first problem was that there might be no DNA left in the bones at all. The damp sewer and the heat of Israel might have destroyed it, but there was only one way to find out. First, Fairman extracted bone powder from the center of the bones, where it was less likely to be contaminated with modern DNA.
Contamination is really the bane of ancient DNA research. It's a problem because the contamination from modern sources, from me or from whoever's handling the samples, that DNA is in so much better shape than the ancient DNA that's actually inside the bone or inside the tooth, that even the teeniest little bit will contaminate a sample, and that's your result.
Researchers must always be gloved and masked. The air in the laboratory is filtered. Ancient bones can be contaminated by one touch or one cell of dried skin from the researcher. The Ashkelon bone powder was washed, spun, heated, and put on ice in order to strip away impurities and to reduce it down to pure DNA. The critical process was amplification. This machine works like a photocopier, duplicating the fragmented ancient DNA until there is enough to actually test. The final stage was electrophoresis, which translates DNA into a readable result. Samples of DNA, colored blue, are put on a gel. An electric current drives it through the gel, and then the results are viewed under ultraviolet light. Fairman could now tell whether the DNA was male or female, according to the number of bands each sample made on the gel. The longer set of bands was a control of modern DNA. The two short bands were the ancient DNA, and both were male. Other gels, recorded as photographs, showed similar results. Lanes 10 to 14 are Ashkelon DNA. In each case, there are two telltale bands, corresponding to the X and Y chromosome. So each of these 5 individuals is also a boy. Dr. Fairman tested the bones of 43 babies. Only 19 of them yielded DNA, and of the 19, 14 turned out to be boys, and just 5 were girls. One possibility had to be investigated: contamination.
If I got those results, I would first be very excited that I got all this difficult nuclear DNA to amplify from very old samples. So it would be a very exciting result, and I would be excited that my negative controls were negative, and I would then immediately want to find some way to confirm that it's not contamination.
Fairman is certain that her results are genuine because she did not manage to get results from all the bones.
The success rate of the sex identification was only 44%. Less than half of the bones yielded amplifiable DNA. And if all the bones were contaminated from previous handling, then we should have ended with 100% of sex identification. And this was not the case.
Fairman also compared the Ashkelon DNA sequences with those of everyone who had handled the bones, including the male archaeologists. They did not match, so her results were real. For Pat Smith, the interpretation was clear.
The samples are small, but they certainly suggest that there was some choice here, with boys being preferentially killed.
The mystery had taken another twist. The murder case was taking the archaeologists into uncharted waters.
We were really surprised to find that there were more boys in the sewers than girls, and by a substantial number, because normally we'd expect many more girls than boys to be the victims of this horrible practice.
The Ashkelon DNA results proved that the Romans did indeed kill their sons, sometimes in greater numbers than their daughters. Perhaps Roman parents did, after all, value girls as much as boys. But to explain why, in Ashkelon, parents were killing more sons than daughters, there was still a line of inquiry to follow: the location of the bones beneath the bathhouse. This building was to lead the archaeologists to an entirely new angle on the case.
And we were curious as to why this place, this area of the city, had all of these bones. When we started examining the fact that there was a bathhouse above, which is not a big public bath, but a private bath, which we thought had been a bordello, then we started wondering if there was a connection.
When the archaeologists excavated the bathhouse, they found an intriguing inscription, "Enter and enjoy," written in Greek. They also found pottery with erotic designs. These finds suggested to them that the bathhouse might also have been a brothel, an interpretation that might account for the presence of the baby boys in the sewer below.
Maybe the courtesans in the bathhouse or prostitutes were getting pregnant regularly, so they would immediately dispose of those babies that they brought to term. Abortion itself would have been too dangerous to practice, so it would have been safer just to let the baby come to term and then terminate its life right immediately after its birth.
According to this theory, the prostitutes were not just getting rid of babies, they were selecting. Boy babies were thrown away because they were not as useful. Girls were kept and brought up in the bathhouse brothel to provide the next generation of prostitutes. So perhaps this is the secret that Ashkelon has concealed for the last 2,000 years. A secret that would shed light on something central to Roman culture: prostitution. Naples, in southern Italy. Tom McGinn is an expert on Roman prostitution. He paints the darkest picture of this world, a sex industry based on legal slavery.
Slavery made it all the easier to compel women and men to prostitution. Slavery meant complete ownership by one person of another, and that meant ownership of that person's body. The other factor worth mentioning with regard to the exploitative nature of Roman prostitution is the extreme variation of wealth and poverty in the Roman world. Most people were desperately poor, and many people were driven to prostitute themselves or family members, such as parents prostituting children. They simply had to do it, they felt, in order to sustain life.
McGinn is traveling to the one place in the world where evidence of the Roman sex industry remains intact: Pompeii. Perhaps this site will help us judge the truth of the Ashkelon prostitution theory. Pompeii, in southern Italy. Unlike Ashkelon, this Roman city is almost intact. When Mount Vesuvius erupted nearly 2,000 years ago, it covered Pompeii with a blanket of volcanic ash, which killed thousands, but preserved the buildings and the artwork as a record of how the Romans really lived. Throughout the summer months, thousands of tourists of every nationality flood the city streets. One aspect of Roman life draws them like no other: sex. The Romans were not embarrassed by sexuality. It was something to be admired, not covered up.
Right, there's the big salami, and the left, money.
That's God Priapus of there. I remember you that that's God of the fertility, procreation, abundance, and fortune. It's not an erotic sign. What you're looking at, it's a God.
But there is a darker side to the sex lives of the Romans. Court records tell a story about a woman called Theodora, who sued the murderer of her prostitute daughter.
Theodora was a woman whose daughter a prostitute, had been murdered by one of the town councilors of Alexandria. At his trial, she says to the court that by murdering her daughter, he had robbed her of her livelihood. This is why I gave my daughter to the pimp, so that I would have a means to living. It's left to the prefect to express sympathy for the plight of the daughter. Theodora is more concerned with the impact of this situation on herself.
Clearly, some Roman mothers did prostitute their daughters, as the Ashkelon archaeologists suspected. But will their theory of a combined bathhouse brothel stand up to the architectural evidence of Pompeii? The city's star attraction is its uniquely well-preserved brothel. If the Ashkelon bathhouse was also a bordello, it would have to look something like this.
On the ground floor are 5 cubicles, 3 on that side, 2 on this side, with a latrine all the way in the back. There are 5 more rooms upstairs. The evidence which makes this practically certain to be a brothel are, first of all, the stone beds, which you find in cubicles on the ground floor, stone beds with stone pillows in each one of these 5 cells. On the walls, there was found over 120 examples of erotic graffiti, including the names of clients like our friend Victor here. In addition to names of clients and of prostitutes, we have prices for an act of prostitution. Various sexual services are recorded. We've also got the testimonials by clients as to their satisfaction with the services provided in this place.
In the eyes of experts, no Roman building can be considered a brothel unless it has small cubicles like these, ideally with stone beds. But this place is packed with other evidence, including drawings.
There are a series of pictures above the entrances to the cubicles, most of which depict, in a rather explicit way, sexual acts. They are presented in a setting, however, of luxury, which contrasts starkly with what we can reconstruct of the arrangements in the cubicles themselves, which are Spartan to say the least. Stone beds, stone pillows, with a thin mattress thrown over them. You can't get any different from the depictions you find in the erotic art, which market not just sex, in a sense, but a fantasy of sex to the client, of low status himself, who could only aspire to the sorts of things that he saw in the art.
Here we can reconstruct every aspect of Pompeii's sex industry, the psychology of its clients, even the detail of price, thanks to graffiti.
The graffiti show us a number of prices, the most common of which was 2 asses. An ass was a small copper coin, and 2 asses was the price of a flask of cheap wine, suggesting that this was not an upmarket venue for the sale of sex. In fact, the prices recorded at Pompeii are among the lowest we have for the entire Roman world.
Made in every part of the Roman city. Prostitution was not illegal. In fact, some town councils levied a tax on it. Many buildings, bars, hotels, taverns, and bathhouses doubled as brothels. But to do that, they needed a particular architecture. In Pompeii, there is a building which some experts argue was a combined bathhouse brothel, so it may be the model for Ashkelon's. It is called the suburban bathhouse.
This is the changing room of the baths, where bathers left their clothes when they went off for their bathing ritual.
On the walls were once lockers for clothes, and above each locker space is an erotic drawing, very much like those in the brothel.
Is there a connection here between the bath and the operation of a brothel? Or were these simply intended to help people remember where they put their clothes? Or were they simply intended to make people laugh because the sexual situations depicted are so over the top?
If there was a brothel here, it would be upstairs, above the baths.
This level of the bath complex contains some small rooms, a series of small rooms that could have been used as cubicles by prostitutes and their clients. We lack the inset stone beds we saw in the brothel, which adds up to the fact that this could have been a brothel, but we lack final proof.
In Ashkelon, there is much less evidence to examine. So will the archaeologists be able to prove that their bathhouse also doubled as a brothel? Ashkelon. In the 3rd century AD, over 100 babies, the majority of them male, were dumped in a sewer here. Attempting to solve this mystery has forced the archaeologists to confront the dark reality of Roman life, the routine killing of unwanted children. Larry Steger and Ross Voss are confident that their prostitution theory best accounts for the find, because it explains why they found more baby boys than girls.
Well, of course, as an archaeologist, you think about the context in which things are found. And when we had a bathhouse above the sewers in which all the babies, and especially the boy babies, were discarded, it seemed sort of logical that if this were also a brothel, the girl babies would have been preferred to be reared within that establishment and maybe more boys discarded.
For the female courtesans, it would have been an insurance measure on their part if they got too old to carry on their trade, that their daughters, their children, would be the next to raise, to do the work and to ensure the welfare of their families.
Voss and Steger have a very neat theory to account for the presence of the baby boys beneath this building. But how good is their evidence for believing that the bathhouse was a brothel? They found no traces of graffiti, cubicles, or stone beds. Nor did they find evidence of a staircase, which would prove the building had a second story. Can they even be certain that there was a second floor at all to house the prostitutes?
I don't think there's any doubt that they had at least 2 stories, maybe 3 in most of these buildings in the Roman period. They have quite substantial foundations and would have been easy to build up to that kind of height. So that's probably where they were living, above and around this particular place.
The problem is that in Ashkelon, the archaeologists are dealing with a totally different state of preservation to Pompeii. The city was destroyed in the 12th century, and its ruins looted, so there is much less evidence for them to work with. But Steger and Voss do know that their bathhouse was small, smaller than the suburban bathhouse in Pompeii. So could such a small building accommodate enough prostitutes to produce over 100 babies?
Well, it's quite a large number of babies, there's no doubt about that. But I think that one thing we have to take into consideration is just how long this place was in operation, and it could have been well over a century. So if you're talking about over 100 years, I imagine, you know, a few dozen prostitutes coming and going could produce quite a number of illegitimate children.
So this bathhouse brothel may have been functioning long enough to account for so many babies. But there is another problem for the prostitution theory. Brothel prostitutes were at the very bottom of the sex industry hierarchy. They were slaves, and as such, did not have the right to dispose of their own children.
Any child born to a slave, whether prostitute or no, belonged to the slave's owner. That was the law of Rome. This meant that any children born to notional prostitutes at Ashkelon or anywhere else would have been the property of the owner, their pimp, to dispose of as he or she pleased.
The prostitute's pimp might kill their male babies, but he could also sell them, which for a pimp might be the more attractive option. The women would have no choice.
Boy babies had other uses in the Roman economy as prospective slaves. And there, too, I think the logical thing would have been for the pimp to sell them to somebody who could put them to some other use, so that even if he or she wasn't about to employ them or raise them as slaves, others might well have been ready to do that. And making money off human misery was the stock and trade of the pimp.
Perhaps prostitution is not the answer to the mystery. Perhaps it's something simpler, and the clue is the sewer itself.
The excavators have suggested that these babies were thrown or taken into a sewer, a deep, dark place where there was no way out. No one was ever going to come along and find these babies, and that to me suggests that perhaps they were already dead. It could be the place where stillborn babies or babies who had died at or around the time of birth were taken. We know that babies of that age weren't thought of as fully human, so they couldn't be taken to a cemetery. They had to be placed somewhere.
So could it be that these infants died a natural death? And this was, for their mothers, a normal place to put them. It is a question for forensics to answer. And for Professor Smith, the very young age of the babies is still the key.
It is, of course, possible that these were stillborn infants, and that what we have here is a natural occurrence. But normally, if newborn infants, because they're stillborn, are disposed of in such a casual fashion, one finds the same practice extending to slightly older infants, even those dying a couple of months old. And our main basis for saying that this was a place where only the products of infanticide were disposed of was the fact that there is absolutely no evidence for any older infants, even those of a week or so old, and again, the fact that they were disposed of, thrown, if you like, into a sewer.
Professor Smith is firm in her understanding of the forensic evidence. All the babies being just a few days old means infanticide. But whether their mothers were prostitutes, killing boys and keeping girls, has to remain a theory. It cannot be concretely proved. But as forensic evidence for the practice of infanticide on a massive scale, the Ashkelon case remains unique.
It really is a grim picture that we have when we look into this sewer with any kind of knowing eyes, and it's one that is very discouraging about things that were going on in that culture. But nevertheless, the evidence is there, and it seems to point all in one direction. So we've got to somehow deal with it and try to explain it.
We will probably never know exactly what happened in Ashkelon, but the case forces us to recognize just how differently children were valued in a culture in which life was brutal and short.
We can't judge people by our own modern Western values. We've got to avoid the value judgments on these societies and try and think more in terms of how different they were from us, not assume that they behaved in a way that we can understand and also that we can denigrate.
A 100 years after Ashkelon, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, and the practice of infanticide was banned. The era of child murder, officially at least, was over. But for the 100 children left in the sewer, it came too late.